Hello, Gordon here. Hope all is well with you. This Facebook Live I've called Strapped In and Ready to Go, because I'm talking about the moon landing. Well, not the moon landing, the moon launch. Well, actually, not the launch from the moon, the launch from the Earth. You know what I mean. Apollo 11. And when I say strapped in and ready to go, the astronauts, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Mike Collins, they would have been strapped in right now. Right now, at this minute, 50 years ago. Graham's watching and saying good morning, good morning. I'm talking about the moon launch, 50 years ago today. They actually lifted off at 2:32 in the afternoon UK time. Let me just see what the time is now, hang on. Right, it's 11:41 in the morning here, so we're about 3 hours away, just under 3 hours from when they lifted off. 2:32 in the afternoon in the UK, 50 years ago today, back in July 1969. Staggering. And the three of them would have been strapped in right now, sitting on top of the biggest rocket that had ever been made previously, and they haven't made one as big since because they haven't needed to. And it's basically a big bomb. And they set the bomb off in a controlled explosion which sent it going upwards at such a high rate and such a high speed that it went into the atmosphere. All technical stuff. And talking about the technical side of it, it's been well documented and spoken of since that the computer processing power that they used to send men to the moon 50 years ago in 1969 is less than I've got in this device. I'm using an Android smartphone to do this Facebook Live, and this phone has more processing and capabilities than the moon computers by a factor of how many? Hundreds? No. Thousands? Hundreds of thousands of times more processing ability and speed. Unbelievable. It is actually unbelievable that they did it. Of course, there is a movement that says, well, we didn't do it. It's all a bit of a hoax. We never actually went to the moon because we couldn't. We didn't have the technology to do it. We don't have the technology to do it now, and we didn't have the technology to do it back then. There's no way it could have happened. There is a big movement of people that say that. And it's funny, I've looked into, whenever I hear a conspiracy theory, I like to look into it to see the debunking videos and the arguments that the people made. And a lot of moon conspiracy, moon hoax theory is to do with looking at the photos from the moon. Well, okay, so most of the photo conspiracy from the moon, they've been debunked. But some of them, there are questions. There are questions that the conspiracists asked, particularly about the moon landing, that they say it never happened. There are questions that they ask, which you think, well, hang on, that is an interesting question. I'm one of the people that think we did go to the moon. Unless I see enough evidence to tell me that we didn't, I think that we did. And I think it was a staggering opportunity, not only because of the tiny size of the computers that I've mentioned, but the speed at which it was achieved. Because it was done in July 1969, not coincidentally. That was done for a reason. Two reasons. Firstly, because the US were desperate to get there before the Russians, because this was the height of the Cold War, and the propaganda value of getting to the moon first between the USA and the Russians was huge. So the United States were desperate to get there first. That's one reason why the program was rushed. Second reason the program was rushed was because President Kennedy had declared the aim of getting a man to the moon by the end of the decade. And he had said that in the early 60s, and we know it was the early 60s because he was killed in 1963. November 63, Kennedy was assassinated. And after he died, that sort of gave a bit of an impetus to the program. So, well, we really need to do it now. Because had he not been killed, and had he been alive, is it likely that they may well have said, we're not going to do it by the end of the 60s? Yes, that is very likely, actually. But after he'd been assassinated and all the hoo-ha that went with that, that prompted the push to get it done by the end of the 60s. So July 1969, 50 years ago, those three men right now would have been strapped in with about 3 hours before being blown into the atmosphere. Liliana is saying, I can't help wonder though, if they were able to land on the moon in the 1960s, then why didn't they repeat the experiment ever since, especially with how technology has evolved so much since? That's a good question. And the general answers to that is, well, they did repeat it. There were several Apollo missions that went to the moon right up to 1974. And I think there were 6 missions to the moon, because I think there were 12 men that have been on the moon. So that's 2 men for each mission. 12 men have been on the moon. And by the time they'd got to 1974, the public interest had diminished and dwindled because people had seen it. They'd already seen it 5, 6 times. It didn't have that interest anymore. Secondly, they had discovered by then, through 6 actual men landing on the moon, men landing missions to the moon, they'd discovered what they'd already known previously about the moon, is that it's cold and grey and not a lot going on. So there wasn't any need to have this vast expense to go back again. Why would they bother? No need to, and no justification for the expense. Another reason they haven't done it since is because a lot of the details, the technical details of how they did it, don't exist anymore. It's a bit like live TV programs at the time. Treasured comedies were just binned. They were made live and they were kept for 6 months and then just binned because that concept of thinking forwards to the future wasn't there at the time. So a lot of the technical details about how we went to the moon in 1969 don't exist anymore, as staggering as that might be. And the conspiracy theorists say, well, how convenient. And it's an interesting one, isn't it? And now NASA are talking about going back to the moon so that we can then use that as a staging post to go to Mars. And they say one of the main problems of going back to the moon is going through the Van Allen radiation belt. And here's another interesting one, because the conspiracy theorists say, well, if we can't get through the Van Allen radiation belt safely now, surely that means that we couldn't have done it 50 years ago. Surely. Logic dictates that if we can't do it now, unless there's evidence that we did it 50 years ago, we couldn't do it 50 years ago, so we didn't do it 50 years ago. Now, the scientists will say, well, we've got evidence that we did go to the moon. And the conspiracy theorists will say, well, what evidence? Photos? Because there are well-established problems with some of the photos. It is fascinating. It really is fascinating. And there were maybe 500,000, 400,000 people that worked on the Apollo programs. So the conspiracy debunkers say, what, you're telling me that 500,000 people were all in on the conspiracy? And the conspiracy theorists say, no, because although there were 400,000, 500,000 people working on the program, they were all working on individual components. So they were all compartmentalized. So all of these people in the program would never actually, they might think that they were a small piece in a big jigsaw. But if it was a pretend jigsaw, the only people who would actually need to know if they went to the moon or not would be maybe the 3 men in the rocket and the camera crew, the fake camera crew. So it's a tiny number of people. It could be that the mission controller, the flight controller, all the people sitting at the desks and terminals, they thought it was all happening. Because why wouldn't they? Fascinating. But just because is it possible that that's all true then? Well, yes, it's possible. Doesn't mean it is true though, does it? Doesn't mean it is true. And that's the fascinating bit. So I haven't yet seen enough to convince me that we didn't go. And I've seen enough from the scientists to persuade me that we did go. So I'm still in the we did go camp. But am I open-minded about it? Yes, I'm open-minded. I'm open-minded about all the conspiracies. And there's lots of them, by the way. I'm not so sure about flat Earth. I think I'm less open-minded about flat Earth. I think that one's the least likely to be true. But anyway, going slightly down a tangent, but it's not that much of a tangent because I'm talking about launching, sending a man to the moon on this day, July 1969, 50 years ago. And if there's quite a large body of people that say, well, it never happened, why are you celebrating and noting it? That's quite an important point. So it's not that much of a tangent. Lydiana, I love your approach to seeing both parts, pros and cons. Well, thank you. And it's an important point because I have got lots of opinions, as you may well have noticed, read and heard. But I like to back up my opinions with a thought process. So that if someone has an opinion that disagrees with mine, I will ask them why or what makes you say that. And an answer I get often back is, well, I don't know. Or just because. And then I say, well, hang on, that's not an answer, is it? Just because, that isn't an answer. And I don't know, well, that's probably even worse. Because if you've got an opinion, but you don't know why you've got that opinion, that means it's probably not your opinion. That probably means that you're spouting someone else's opinion. You think that something is true because you've heard it from someone else. It's massively important in the self-improvement, goal achievement, life transformation field that we research our opinions and challenge our opinions to ourselves and be open to our opinions and beliefs to being challenged in the future. So anyone could tell me anything today, or I could come across something today which could challenge any of my beliefs and opinions. And I'm open to looking at it. I might not be persuaded, but I'm open to looking at it. Lydiana, just because is the go-to answer of exhausted and exasperated parents. Yes, I've never had kids. Tempted to say, thank goodness. So I've never had to go through that just because experience. So yes, in the 5 key areas of life, health, wealth, career, relationships, lifestyle, talking about challenging our opinions and beliefs. If we went to the moon 50 years ago in 1969, what do you think you could do in those 5 key areas that maybe you've told yourself that you can't do? And if I said to you, why can't you do it? You might say, well, I don't know. I just can't. Or you might say, I can't do it because so-and-so has told me I can't do it. Well, hang on. What have you told yourself? What have you researched? And what have you tried to do it? Because if we look at launching, sending man to the moon 50 years ago, it was staggeringly unbelievable, almost impossible to believe, but it was done. Took a lot of time, took deaths, astronauts dying in the program, but it happened. It was thought to be impossible, but we did it. So think about all the things that, and I've spoken about this before by the way, whether your goal is for you to be the first to ever do it. Now they were the first to go to the moon, clearly, but whatever your goal is in those 5 key areas, are you the first person to ever think about, want to, or try to do it? Well, I don't know what your main goal is, so that could be the case, but probably no. Probably no, you're not the first. And if you're not the first, that means someone else has done it. And if someone else has done it, that means the information is out there about how to do it. And that means that you've got a plan that you can follow as a starting point. So if you say, I don't know how to do it, this is what I want to do, but I don't know how. Well, look at people that have already done it and find out how they did it. That is a superb starting point. Fascinating, isn't it? And in all the time that I've been talking, which is quite a lot because I've slipped into waffle mode, I know, all the time I've been talking, those 3 men were still strapped into their capsule for another 3 hours. And it took them 4 days to get to the moon. And they were in a capsule about the size of a car. 3 men in the size of a car for 4 days. Not easy. Not easy. No one said it was easy at any time. And even when they were landing, which I might talk about on the 20th when they landed, it nearly went very badly wrong because there was a load of warning lights that went off as Armstrong and Aldrin were getting down towards the surface. The display board lit up like a Christmas tree with a load of alarm bells. What's happening here? What's happening there? And all the astronauts could say, well, Houston, we've got alarm bells and alarm codes going off here. And Houston was scrabbling around saying, yeah, well, we're looking at that. Don't worry about it for now. We're looking at that. And what had actually happened was because the computers were so small and so slow, they were actually trying to process too much information at the same time and had basically given up the ghost, the computers, so they were lighting up their lights saying, no, we've had enough, we can't do it anymore. And the lander was running out of fuel. So it was a massive problem. And one of the major solvers of the problem was a fail-safe that had been written into the computer programming by a woman called Margaret Hamilton. And the fail-safe that she introduced meant that when the commander of the mission, Neil Armstrong, he made a decision about whether to abort, which he could have done, or carry on and land and go past the point of no return. When he made the decision, that failsafe that Margaret Hamilton had coded in meant that the computers then focused on less information and less data. So the alarm bells went off and they were allowed to land. With 30 seconds of fuel left. Landed by hand by Armstrong. It had been going towards a field of boulders, nasty, but because of Armstrong's decision and his skill and his calmness under pressure and Margaret Hamilton's coding, they were able to land with 30 seconds of fuel. So I might touch on that on the 20th of July, but I've just touched on it there, so I can do something else on the 20th, can't I? Fascinating, staggering, unbelievable about what we can do using what we've got up here if we allow ourselves to free up the potential. So let me know what you think. Let me know what you think about those 3 men still strapped into the capsule 50 years ago today on the launch pad, ready to be blown into space. Let me know what you think about the message. Leave your comments below if you're watching a replay. I'd love to hear your feedback. Hope all is well with you. And for the next 4 days plus, I'm going to be thinking a lot about what we did as a species 50 years ago and what we can do as a species, as humanity, and as individuals in our own individual lives 50 years later after we did that staggering achievement. Okay, signing off for now. Hope all is well with you. Wishing you as ever health and happiness, and I'll speak to you again soon.